ready. You guys ready in the audience?
Yeah. All right.
Still hanging in there? Energy after 2 days of this? You guys, you're all doing great. Well, welcome. My name is Brandon Busteed. I'm president of Kaplan University Partners. And a little bit of additional relevance around this. I used to lead the higher education practice at Gallup, and we're involved in a number of studies around some of these subjects. So, but anyway, I'm delighted. We've got an unbelievable panel today. Starting on my left, Marten Roorda, who's the CEO of ACT. We also have Todd Rose from Harvard. We've got Earl Lewis from University of Michigan, and Frida, Polli, who is the founder and CEO of Pymetrics. And you see the title in the program, right? This is about assessment. We might call it testing. There's a lot of different words used, and we might want to talk about that a little bit because I think it's important to the conversation. When we think about assessment writ large, there's a lot of different reasons why we use assessment, and I kind of want to start there, right? There's summative assessments, formative assessments. We can go in a little bit more detail about the important nuances there, but there's assessments that are used to select people for certain things, whether we think about that educationally or in a work setting. And there's also assessments that are used for developmental purposes, right, like a diagnostic. So I kind of want to start with some framing with Todd by asking you to kind of talk about assessment for what?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was so intrigued by this, by like thinking about, obviously we've got to measure, like it's so important. But I love the second part of this is what got me excited about this panel is without crushing human potential. And you know, when I think about it, I think we've gotten really good at measuring to differentiate, measuring for selection, which there is a role for that, and it's important. But I think about like most of what we hear at this conference, most of what we hear about the sort of future of education, actually is largely about developing people, right? Which I think has a different perspective. And I think that for me, when I think about human potential, like it makes sense in the aggregate and I get okay, and then I get really nervous when I start hearing that word being used for individuals, right? Because I start to worry like, are we putting a cap on someone? Are we trying to sort? So I think that this is a really important topic, and I think from my perspective, if we frame it from a standpoint of what do we have to know about someone in order to develop them to their full potential, we could get somewhere interesting.
And so obviously that's an inspiring goal for assessment. Not all assessment is used that way. A lot of people think about it as something that limits their potential, right? They've been told that they aren't a fit for the job or they didn't get into that university. So I think it's important to kind of pause on how do we use this, because there's also a difference too between what these things were designed for, their intent, and how they're actually being used. And those are not always in alignment. But Marten, I'm really interested. You've been at ACT now for a little while and have done a lot of transformation in terms of where the organization is headed. You described to me that you're trying to become a learning organization and thinking about measurement in the context of learning. Tell us more about that. That's a big move coming from a place like ACT.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you, Brandon. And as to what my neighbor Todd was saying, it's all about the purpose of measurement. And I like the term measurement better than assessment or testing because it's much broader. It's looking for much more types of data. And it's about data because I believe in the learning process to be data-driven. That's the only way you can get to better outcomes. But there's only one way to get data, and that's through measurement. So that's why we need the measurement to inform the learning. And the transformation at ACT is all about integrating the measurement into the learning to make that one combined thing. And so the work we've been doing over the last 3 years was mainly, building what you could call the operating system of the new learning. And so that's not so much about the linear, like textbook approach that we're used to. But if I mention some of the components that we collected over the years, then it becomes clear that this is a whole new learning ecosystem. You talk about things like dynamic or open educational resources, knowledge graphs or taxonomies like ACT's holistic framework, alignment tools so that you can align content to learning objectives or standards, recommending engines or diagnostic engines, engines to score things automatically or to produce content automatically. So there's all kinds of components that we collected. So now we're finished what you could call the operating system of the new learning ecosystem. So now we're able to fully integrate the learning and the measurement, and also provide the guidance for navigation along with that.
Right. I mean, it's a shift in that, we've thought classically about a test, a standardized test is something that measures whether somebody learns something in a curriculum. This is now also about measurement that's helping decide what people need to learn, right? So I mean, it's not just an assessment at the end, it's actually a live part of that learning process, which I think is very exciting. We're all idealists in trying to think about, what a more perfect world might look like in terms of how measurement is used. Earl, I wanted to ask you a question about, where have we seen great success, right? Examples of where measurement, assessment, other kinds of data collection tools have really worked for us. Give us a sense of what's the ideal out there right now?
Thanks for the question. If you think back to the evolution of testing in the US, and particularly in the 20th century, and where, to go back to Todd's point, it was really testing for access. We've sort of slowly, as we got to the back end of the 20th century into the beginning of the 21st century, try to shift the frame a little bit to testing for success. I mean, trying to move from access to success. And what does that mean? That requires then not only, as Marten knows, robust data sets, but the ability of institutions then to actually make use of those data sets in ways that began to both change outcomes on the ground. And so the one that is often was cited in this room earlier this week, is Georgia State, which Ithaca S&R did a study in 2015 that looked at Georgia State's ability to actually monitor 800 variables on their students and do so per night. And then try to figure out where to go in and intervene the next day, where students ended up in the red zone, because they realized that early intervention could actually improve outcomes. The net result of that was actually a 20% increase in overall graduation rates for the entire student body population and the disappearance of the racial gap. And so there's this powerful way in which, if institutions are willing to turn on themselves and actually think of themselves as a laboratory for change, they actually have the essentially base resources to begin to affect that kind of change. And Georgia State referred to it as the GPS. And so the Lincoln Project, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, put out a couple of years ago, highlighted that as one of the best examples of an institution using its own institutional data and building systems around it to support students for success.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask a quick follow-up question. How many of you have heard about the Georgia State success story in this? I mean, it's been well publicized. If you haven't, it's certainly one to read. But what amazes me, right, is you don't hear about a dozen other universities that have done that. Now, the Georgia State example is not that new. I mean, they've been at this for several years.
Decades.
Their results are almost impossible to argue with, and yet, why aren't there 30 or 300 other institutions doing that? I don't know. Do you just give me a quick, reaction to that?
Well, so in a previous life, I was the president of the Mellon Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we were trying to answer that question. In fact, we were trying to figure out what about the Georgia State example was replicable and what's scalable, and why other institutions actually weren't willing to make the same investments. And a lot of it requires then, in this case, not just a leadership team, but it required you to change the culture of the institution in so many different ways. People were willing to actually invest in the technology or in the data collection, but it required you then to hire counselors. It required faculty to enter data. It required the institution to come up with resources when resources were required. It required a series of things, and that's where it broke down. People were willing to do 1, 2, but not all 8 or 10.
Interesting. Yeah. But there's hope. Is there hope?
There's hope. I mean, there's always hope.
Okay. I was a little worried for a second.
There's someone who used to give away money for a living, and realizing that it was not even enough money to sometimes get people to move, it realized that hope needs to be actually balanced with something more. But there's hope.
Okay. Well, thank you. Okay, that's good. That's refreshing. Speaking of hope, let's talk about AI. And by the way, I think you all know every moderator gets paid an extra $5 every time they mention AI. So I just got 2 credits for that one. So Frida, you've been a pioneer in this, and your company has, applying AI and machine learning and a lot of other, quite frankly, integrative science in the development of assessments really aimed at success in the workplace. And so I'd love for you to kind of talk about how that's unfolding for you, right? Its advantages. And then I know this is kind of a two-pronged question, but we talked about it in advance, so I know you're ready for it. Talk to this audience about how disparate impact plays a role here. And just very quickly, you know, those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, it's the idea that if an employer is going to use an assessment to determine whether they hire somebody, that assessment cannot from a legal perspective, from a legally defensible perspective, it cannot be biased towards a particular protected class, right? And so if it identifies more white men to be hired, that would actually be not legally defensible.
It's actually legally defensible.
That is legally defensible?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Yep.
I'm going to check
I
my...
can give you a
Well,
summary of the
okay,
EOC
so I need to be
regulations,
educated
but-
more
Yeah.
about disparate impact too. So I'm going to hand it over to the real expert, folks. Please,
No, we're
help me out.
good. We're good.
It's morally indefensible. That I would agree, but legally is a different story. So yeah, so very quickly, my background, I spent 10 years at Harvard and MIT as a cognitive neuroscientist, and then saw recruiting firsthand for 2 years at the business school at Harvard. Thought, wow, this hasn't changed a lot since I was in college. And that's where the idea for using different talent signals and machine learning, so I don't get any credits for using AI, could be helpful. So, so that's what the platform does. We look at cognitive, social, and emotional measures in people using assessments, tools really that were developed as research tools in cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and instead of more traditional signals for people that are familiar, I'm sure, to this audience, whether it's resume or test scores or something else. We're also a strengths-based system. So what that means, if you guys aren't familiar with this, is that there is no, unlike the SAT, for example, where generally speaking, people view it as high as nobody studies to get worse scores on the SATs. That's not a business model I've heard of. So, that's a directional assessment. You want to go high on that one. Ours is a non-directional assessment. So any profile could actually be adaptive to a role. It actually is completely customized to the role. So the way we do this is we go in and we have people that are successful in the role at a given company go through the same exact platform that we'd have a candidate do it. And that's how we extract the data using machine learning to understand what the profile of success looks like. And that's called a strengths-based assessment because it basically assumes there is no one profile that will always lead to success. And I think personally that it opens up a lot of doors because first of all, a lot of the problems people have with the idea of crushing human potential is that I think assessment historically writ large has assumed that we can say that there's one thing that's good and another thing that's not good. And I just don't believe in that, quite frankly. I think that that's a kind of a dated model, especially as we enter the world of work where we can't even define a job in the next 2 years, forget about the next decade. To say that there's one thing that would be good everywhere, I think is not correct. I test really well. My daughter's dyslexic. She doesn't. I think we're both equally smart. It's really about figuring out, by test, I mean sort of more standardized traditional testing. So it's really, in my opinion, a strengths-based approach is the right one. And again, my background is I trained in neuropsychology. So a lot of neuropsychology is really figuring out the pattern of behavior that leads to success in different things, not in work, but in other things. So that sort of, I hope, summarizes kind of the first part of what you're asking about. The second piece is actually really interesting. So the reason I interrupted you is because you would think that that's exactly what the law says.
That's what I thought it was.
Yep, so did I when I started down this path. What it actually says is you shouldn't have impact on protected classes, women, people of color, and so on, or underrepresented minorities in general. But then the second thing it says is unless you can prove that it's job related. Now that's a huge caveat because if all of the people that are in that role are Caucasian, I guarantee you're going to pick up on a signal that is going to preferentially, say you should hire more Caucasian people. So it's really a chicken and an egg problem, because if you don't have a diverse workforce and then these assessments are allowed to be job related and biased, or having adverse impact, it's a problem that we really need to get out of. And by the way, these laws were written in the 1970s, when obviously the challenge back then was that that's the predominant makeup of the workforce was Caucasian and male.
Yeah.
So the third thing the law says, and sorry, I've become a little bit of a legal expert and I'm boring you all now, is that you should use the least biased alternative. So it does have this carve out saying, hey, but by the way, you shouldn't be using something that is having adverse impact on women, minorities, if you can find something that's less biased. The challenge is that a lot of assessments, especially the cognitive ones, have been known to have bias towards certain groups. And people just kind of assume that that's just the way it has to be, right? Now, I think that as we kind of, to your point, it closed the racial gap, there have been other interventions that have shown to close gaps that we previously thought were not closable. We have built an assessment that is has cognitive component and is not biased. So I personally believe that the awesome thing about different types of data and machine learning is that we can get to a point where we can improve on the status quo. However, I think that generally speaking, when people think about assessments, unfortunately, because of their legacy of not being always adverse impact free, they don't have a great reputation in the field, and they certainly, in my opinion, would be viewed by people, the public writ large, as crushing human potential. So I think that's kind of where we're at, is that we have a huge potential to actually unleash a whole new set of tools that can really bring us to a point where not only are we doing strengths-based assessment rather than one size fits all, but it's also lacking in gender bias, ethnic bias, age bias, and so on. But we kind of need to move society there.
Right.
So.
And I know Marten and Todd, it sounded like you guys wanted to both add to that too. Yeah. I'll come back to Frida too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's comment first on what you said. So, the ACT, the admissions test, is certainly not biased, because we have very good techniques of filtering that out. It's differential item functioning that you can measure. So it's absolutely not the case. I must admit, though, that you look at ACT's transformation, that there is a trend towards, let's say, a different use of assessment, like a next generation of assessment. We cannot go there at once, but we're working on it, like I explained earlier. And then getting back to the role of artificial intelligence. So we see a lot of artificial intelligence being used in our company now in different aspects. I mentioned the recommendations. We can make learning adaptive through AI techniques, and we can generate content automatically through it. I think what's important to say, though, if we talk about bias, is that those engines and algorithms should be very transparent, not black boxes, and that's what we do. Any work we do is research-based and is being published, and we're accountable for it. So we're also measuring the efficacy with it and making that public. So that's very important if you look at bias.
Yeah, that's great. Todd?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've really admired, Frida, and Pymetrics is my background is actually not in assessment measurement, but in this science of individuality, getting away from aggregate data modeling and then imposing that on individuals, which turns out actually to not have very good predictive power usually. And you can build a science off of patterns of individuality and upward. And one of the couple of core themes in that, which I think is really important, is the multidimensionality of people, right? And it's super hard to deal with. It's in a lot of ways we wanted to reduce to one dimension, because if you're serving a ranking function, you kind of need that, right? And sometimes that is really important, so I don't mean to dismiss that, but if our job is to understand you, we actually can't reduce it like that. And then the second piece is this fundamental role of context, right? I mean, it's messy, but what you find out is these patterns exist in a context, and you just assuming they're general, it doesn't usually hold. So the ability to model a multidimensional person in a context, yep, I think is incredibly promising.
What? Oh, go ahead, Earl. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add a slightly different perspective, and it goes to the starting place. I mean, why do we actually have tests to begin with? and what's the purpose. And if you start with the assumption that human talent is actually evenly distributed across the world, but opportunity to access is not.
Right.
And that what you're trying to do is figure out a way to make sure there is broad access to opportunity. Then you ask different things of tests. But if you start with the idea that you actually kind of control that access to opportunity, you ask a whole different set of questions of your test.
Right.
And I think one of the ways in which we actually think about how to make sure we don't question human potential is to actually begin with a different starting place. Because as my colleagues know, someone like Claude Steele would say that it's not that the tests themselves are biased, but the ways in which human beings actually are situated in society can actually register anxiety in a way that allows them to actually perform poorly at a given time in a given space, depending on what other kind of cues they've heard going into that test taking.
Right.
And so all of that is a piece here that actually can affect then that one day, that one moment, and in context. And I think that requires us who design tests to think about this to actually start in a different place.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think that, so I completely agree. I actually think that what we've seen repeatedly time and time again is that if you build custom algorithms, if they're fit to roll, and if you debias them before you put them into production, we actually see tremendous gains in gender diversity, ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, even age diversity.
Yeah.
And where it's not, I will say it's not rocket science. I think it's just applying basic principles of what we want to see done. So I absolutely 100% think that most, if not all of the companies that work with us, not only do they want better prediction of performance and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, they also see this as an opportunity, a real opportunity to increase access. What I wanted to comment on is that the cognitive testing we do, the reason we believe we don't see the traditional bias that we see in cognitive testing, more historic cognitive testing, is because it's not as linked to your educational access. So what we're measuring are things that are more fundamental, not, it's like the precursor of can you do math? You know what I mean? Can you do math is very dependent on have you ever been exposed to math? What kind of math? And so on, right? As opposed to the precursor is like, can you hold a piece of information in working memory? Can you plan your next move? Those are the types of things we measure that are not, at least that we can see, biased nearly as much from a cultural perspective. So I do think that that's where some of these new behavioral signals can be really powerful, is eliminating the socio-historical context in which society has formed itself as it is and therefore has created, to your point, some of these potentially more artificial biases. So.
Yeah, I want to have you talk a little bit more about it. You talked about a strengths-based model. Obviously, my time at Gallup, that was a big part of the DNA of Gallup,
exactly.
And strengths finder assessment. One of the interesting things about it is there's no right or wrong answer, right? It's how people are kind of innately. It would be what our scientists would call measuring somebody's innate talent.
Correct.
And there were like 34 million different permutations of how you might actually kind of be sorted on that. So. It has some limitation, but essentially no human being has the same talent fingerprint that another human being has. That's essentially, the idea. But where I wanted to go with the question is in its breakthrough and how it's being applied. So as you were describing to me, somebody applies for a job. In the classic sense today, they usually never get any feedback on why they never got a call back or why they weren't a finalist. That's it. It just goes radio silence. They applied for a specific job there, and maybe they didn't get that job, but you never know if they had talent for a different job that they didn't think about applying for. Yep. And I just want you to tell us a little bit about how that strengths-based model actually solves for that in an interesting way.
Yeah, so I think, what we have done are two things. One is we give you some general feedback on kind of where you fall on the spectrum of different things. It doesn't say why you were not a fit for whatever role you applied. Yeah. But I think just getting that feedback is, helpful to people. The more important thing I think we do is we allow the tech enablement of our platform says you apply to job A, you're actually not as good a fit for A as you thought you were, but you're a fantastic fit for B, we're actually going to reroute you. And that's not only within the company you applied to, we actually allow you to do that across our partner companies. So it really turns a job application into more of a career search at the back, not at the back end, but after the initial application has been made. And I think that's super powerful because I think, so again, look, I was a good student, I got good grades, I tested well, I was the person that benefited from the system that we live in today, right? But I think we've artificially created the system where if you're good at school, that means you must be good at work. And I think that that's just not right, because there are many things I would suck at and many things I do suck at. And I think that even though I was good in school, and I think that people that are bad in school, for whatever that means, have tremendous ability to do so many things. And I think we've kind of created this thing where school is the same everywhere. You got to learn the same things. You got to crunch through this. And that then becomes the launching pad for work. And I think that that disadvantages, huge pieces of, the future workforce, and I think we kind of have to move away from there. There's huge value to education and being good in school. I love school. I'm a nerd. So I'm not saying you should drop out of college or anything like that. I had too many advanced degrees. But I don't think we should keep judging people based on how well you do in traditional academic settings for then, judging them for the rest of their lives as to what they could be good at.
Right, and I'll come to Marten real quick though, but I just want to pause on one of the things you said that I think is amazing. You just said that the employers you work with are essentially sharing candidates in a pool. Did you all catch that? I mean, I want to make sure you didn't miss that point.
They are special. Our group of employers are special. I have
But,
to say.
if
we
it's
do have
happening.
Close to 100 of them. So
right.
they're,
It started, it's possible, right? They're
Totally.
clearly understanding,
For
maybe they applied to XYZ company, but another company has that
The
opportunity.
numbers are terrible. The numbers,
that's-
you hire 5%, I mean, depending on,
Right.
the industry, obviously,
Yeah.
right? But let's take, a job that requires a bachelor's. The typical
Right.
rejection rates are like 90%, 95%. Like, why would you want to piss off, excuse my French, that number of people that are applying?
You get 10
to it?
points for swear words, by the way.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
But my point is, why would you want to do that when you can actually help them? And I
Right.
think most people have kind of come around.
But it
to
seems
that
like
idea,
that's,
but
I
it
know
is pretty cool, I agree.
there's innovation around that, but the innovation is really the notion that companies would share candidate pools, right? Like, why wouldn't universities do that more frequently? Think about this college admissions process that has become, right? Why not? A student that didn't get accepted here, but would be a good fit here. There's so many opportunities here in this space. So anyway, I didn't mean to cut off your thought process, Marten, but yeah.
Collusion.
No, just trying to build on what Frida was saying about looking at strengths. Of course, that's great. You also have to look at those skills that could be developed to make students more successful. So I would say, if you look at the academic skills, that's obvious. But we also have to focus on the non-academic skills. HT is doing a lot of work in that area. It ranges from social emotional learning, including the professional development and the curriculum with it, but also what we call cross-cutting capabilities. That's more cognitive things, but that is non-academic. So, for instance, collaborative problem solving. We even developed an assessment of creative thinking for the OECD. So those factors are all very important, and my opinion is they can all be developed and be grown. So if you do that, you make students much more successful. So you should also focus on those skills.
Yeah, and so in the theme of skills, maybe the last question for the panel, and then I'm going to open it up with the last 10 minutes to the audience. So think about what you'd like to ask these folks. But talk about upskilling, right? This is another buzzword that I think we get extra money for saying at this conference. And in the context of how measurement can be used to help people upskill, right? To understand, I know work keys is number of niches you're involved in. Frida, that's a big part of what you're doing, right? I would just love all you to comment on the potential of measurement in the upskilling framework for working adults.
Well, our take is really that, the way that we traditionally describe through a job description, evaluate through a resume scan, and everything else is really just very poorly equipped for dealing with the future, and the future is here now. And so what we do is we basically use our assessment to look at different roles at different companies, and we can use that for reskilling as much as we can for recruiting, right? Think of reskilling as internal recruiting, and so you know what makes for success in these new roles that are not at risk of automation. You know the pools of employees that are at risk for losing their jobs, and now it's a matching process of where can I find the best fit between that. We don't reskill, but we offer that matching, which I think is kind of the first step. So
It makes me think about what Earl talked about, though, right? Like that at the end of the day, like this could work fantastically, but then you have to have a system that understands those changes at the same time, like that investment.
Yeah, I mean, and in some ways, if you think, so let's take McKinsey at his word for a second. So McKinsey came out with a report in the end of 2017 that says somewhere between 2015, 2030, at the bottom end, 400 million jobs, at the top end, 800 million jobs worldwide will disappear by 2030. 54 million in the United States, 1/3 of the contemporary American workforce. You know, we can give them 50%, so there's only 27 million, and not 50. But that's in a very compressed period of time.
Right.
And so trying to figure out, so the upskilling piece, I think, is only a small part of the fraction of things that we're going to be confronted with trying to address in the next decade. And because there are going to be a number of people who are going to be displaced, and the political and social consequences of that are going to be profound. Right. And so our ability to actually begin to address some of the things that Frida was talking about, I think it's going to require a whole range of new players, but also the adjustment of the players already in the system.
Right. But the missing piece to that, because the WEF put out a piece that said something similar, but then they also said, you know, it's like 70 net loss, 125 million net gain. So it's really about making that transition.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah, I know exactly
Yep.
what you mean. And,
Yep.
and the challenge is right, at least in all the meetings I've been in around the country, we have the 70% net gain, but no one can tell you where it is.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
this is
And well, no, that's actually not true. So they put out this report that actually they did it with BCG and Burning Glass, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
And they tried to map where the actual net gain was going to be. We can be skeptical.
Well,
We can be
yeah, I was going to
skeptical,
say,
but I think you're right. We may not know where it's going to be, but again, from what we see, like, you know, there's an interesting comment that Rachel, the CEO of Guild, made at an earlier session, where she basically said, you know, instead of trying to force all truck drivers to code, why don't we realize that actually truck drivers make great drone pilots, because that's a very overlapping mentality, skill set, and so on, right? So it really is about, and think about drone pilots, that's something that you never would have thought someone would make a career out of. Anyways, my point is I do think the matching component is going to be super critical, even though we don't exactly know where people are.
Yeah, I think we can do with the
so.
margins in 15 to 20%, but there's still a big wide gap. But I agree, we can. The challenge is, and I think this goes back to higher education, let alone the rest. So we're trying to map at my center all of the future work projects that have been identified anywhere in the United States, and trying to figure out not only where they are, but also where they think they're working, and see if we can come up with a geotagging to map them all. Because what we realize is right now we got about 400 versions of parallel play.
Yeah.
And those versions of parallel play where the clock is ticking means that even if it's only 15% that we unaccounted for, that's still a pretty sizable 15%, and they may be concentrated in certain communities more than others. And those are profound questions for us as a society that we need to address. And so that was really the core of my point.
So we're going to open it up to questions in the audience. Maybe if we can bring the lights up just a tad. Oh, you got mics. Awesome. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the panel, Brendan. Frida, my question is for you. First of all, obviously, congratulations on Pymetrics' incredible success.
Thanks.
I think the result of that success then has you at a stage where thousands of individuals' futures in some ways can be determined within a 10-minute mobile game, give or take, at least at that point in their journey, based on the assessment they go through with Pymetrics. And while you absolutely are right that the assessment is strength-based, I'm just curious about it still is deterministic, right? And while it might recommend other pathways, if your heart was set on this pathway that you're applying for, that is still a decision that massive organizations are trusting Pymetrics with.
Yep.
And especially how front-end the solution is, it is now, if Pymetrics says no, you're no longer going down the recruitment process for that particular job. So I'm just curious, and this is not, nobody in the ecosystem is as near as you're at solving this, but I'm just curious about how you think about that fundamental question of, it is still individual humans every day taking this test. And if it says no, that career at that point in time, after a 10-minute game where they burst balloons and maybe they don't understand the game as well as you do, might not have a chance to pursue that?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. So there are very, very few employers that use it as a cutoff, very few. So most people are looking at other data points. So what we are is a data point that informs a decision, and then the final decision is made, generally speaking, at the vast majority of employers with some other data in mind. So just to clarify that point. If you are not a fit for the particular algorithm, that only shuts you out of one job at one company, not that job at any other company or even those other companies. So it is, in quotes, deterministic for that particular, and by the way, those models also get refreshed over time, meaning that, you know, the job requirements, the aptitudes, everything else may change. So in that it is deterministic, I guess, in a very narrow sense of the word, because again, it's not a cutoff, and it is literally for that job at that company at that moment. So that's what I would say in response to your question. And I think the other thing is just you have to think of what's the alternative, right? To think that we don't have a, in quotes, much worse, in my opinion, deterministic system in play right now, where, first of all, there are a lot of assessments where if you fail at one place, you will fail everywhere. It's not a strengths-based model. Mm-hmm. That is, those are bigger companies than Pymetrics, I can guarantee you that. And then secondly, even if you're not using an assessment, if you didn't go to an Ivy League school, good luck even getting in the door at any of these places. That is, to my mind, a far worse deterministic system. And so the way that a lot of companies use our product is really to open up their talent pipeline beyond core schools, beyond referral programs, which in my opinion is far, much more likely to lead to a deterministic outcome. There's always going to be there's going to be flaws to any system. You're right, it is a huge responsibility. We take it very seriously, and I'm not trying to minimize that, but I think you have to think of what's the alternative, and I think that the alternative that we live in today is actually a lot more deterministic and a lot more unfair, you know, so.
Other questions? Yes.
Sorry, I got the microphone before you did. But thank you, this is wonderful. And I had a question. I was in a session earlier where a concept came up that I thought was really interesting. And it was one of the directors of research at Microsoft, and we were talking about, you know, another area of assessment that folks were interested in, which was really around skills and strengths-based assessment. And she said, I don't think we need more assessments. We're actually looking at whether we can assess this in place. Can we do analytics on data that we already have on the students' performance and their behavior and assess them without making them sit down and take another artificial tool in an artificial environment, right? And it just blew my mind. I hadn't even thought about it before, but could you guys talk to that, because it's something that didn't come up, and it's certainly a way that, you know, you could do it without crushing people's souls, right?
Well, I can try to answer that. I think that would be a dangerous situation. Of course, you have to use, as you mentioned, as many data points as possible, you know, to better inform the learning or better inform your decisions. But if you would base that only on behavior, like circumstantial evidence, that would be the risk, leading to a risk of being self-deterministic. So you need to build in certain, you know, stimuli to get responses, so that you can really direct, get the right information that you really need. So you need questions that you can ask to get that response, instead of just looking at what's happening. But I think the good thing about the developments we see now in the next generation of assessment is that assessment is completely integrated in that learning process. So back in 2004, I introduced the term stealth assessment. So it will lead to a situation where you won't even notice that you're being tested. It's so integrated that you just, so there's no reason to leave it out anyway.
I think we have time for one more question, so.
This is a question for Frida. You're getting the candidates after whatever education they've already had. Mm-hmm. Have university partners or have consumers or others reached out to you? Because by the time that students get to you, or candidates get to you, a lot of the students themselves would say, I picked the wrong major. I'm trained the wrong way. Have you considered going down the chain a little bit?
Yeah, so we did, and long story short, I think that it's a whole different ecosystem that then you have to kind of think about, the college career center and so on and so forth. And I think ultimately, I think it'd be awesome, right? I think the challenge was that unlike employers, they weren't feeling as much of the pain, so to speak, of, you know, my process isn't working. They felt like, hey, you know, we're doing a good job and our process is working. So we really tried to go with where we felt people were expressing the greatest need. I completely agree with you. I think it can be super helpful. And I also don't think that, you know, 22 is the end-all be-all. I was an English major, pre-med. You know, then I was a neuroscientist. Now I'm an entrepreneur. And my dad is any indication, I'll have two more careers after this. So, you know, I think that we're lifelong learners.
So the moral of the story is Frida needs to settle down and pick a job.
Yeah, exactly, right. Still haven't picked my job.
Well, we are out of time. I want to say thank you to a great audience and thank you to a terrific panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you.